these negotiations. I think we are finally at a point where a landing strip is in sight. You know, the bus, who's under it, who's in front of it, I'm not sure. I don't think Canada was really ever intending to throw anybody under the bus, but there's an orthodoxy in Canada among, you know, grumpy old guys and women that US and Canada have a special relationship. We got that 1988 free trade agreement. We can just make everything better. But that orthodoxy doesn't recognize the importance of Mexico as a market, as a partner, as a supply chain partner. So where are we now in these negotiations? On the auto sector, I think Canada was just as happy to have US and Mexico hammer that out. Again, their interests are probably closer to the US, but they didn't want to be in the room throwing rocks at Mexico either. So after those 5 weeks, we have a pretty good, well, we got something on autos and something on sunset clause. As Arturo said, is it good economics? I don't know, but it is a deal that apparently everybody can live with. On dispute settlement, that's still very much up in the air. For ISDS, at least we know that we have investor state in a couple of key sectors, and where I heard the most pushback on that was from the energy sector. So whether or not we have an energy chapter, and I don't know that we do have investor state protections for energy, and that was something that was very important to a lot of folks that were invested in Mexico. Chapters 19 and 20, I'm not going to practice law without a license. Chapter 19 has been the hill that Canada has died on previous negotiations, a review mechanism for domestic trade remedy decisions. It may be that Canada is ready to let that evolve into some other mechanism that achieves the same effect but is less perceived to be less interventionist by the United States. The unfortunate thing on that is timing. If you look at the number of cases that we've used Chapter 19 on, it's been progressively reduced over the last 20 years, but the one area we use it is softwood lumber, and we are in the midst of a softwood lumber dispute. So there's a lot of high politics on that. I'm going to disagree with Matt, though. I don't think there's a dairy softwood trade-off, because in Canada, the equities of the provinces are very, very, very strong, and so you would have to trade off Quebec dairy for BC softwood, and I don't see that you could necessarily do that within a domestic political brokerage, but I may be wrong. So dispute settlement, it looks like they're coming closer to a negotiated settlement. When I see lawyers trying to problem solve, that makes me much happier than when I see politicians clustered in front of TV cameras. Intellectual property. When I see intellectual property being discussed seriously, I know that we are somewhere near the end game. Back in March, April, we weren't even talking about intellectual property. Now I see the digital elements, the copyright, notice and takedown. I see them talking in the intellectual property patent area, data protection for biologic drugs. The U.S. has put forward a particularly strong position there. I think it's probably something Canada can live with. But all of these decisions have to be filtered through. Does it raise the cost of drugs in the Canadian provincial drug marketing system? So if they can find their way through that, I think we're probably on a path to settlement on IP. Dairy, I think Canada recognizes it has to provide something significant, something symbolically significant. I think the Class 7 milk issue would be a good place to look, because that's where President Trump has focused his ire in particular. At the same time, we look at the notification to Congress last week, and it says, the U.S. notification says, you know, we're okay with domestic support measures, including supply management, as long as they have the least trade restrictive effect possible. So it seems to me that there is some area for movement there. We're not going to see Canada get rid of its supply management system, though privately some in Ottawa would love to get rid of supply management, but they are looking for a path to wind it down eventually. There was already market access concessions in the Canada-EU agreement and Trans-Pacific Partnership, so we would expect to see market access that exceeded the TPP commitment there. Culture. This came up last week, and I'm like, well, where the heck did that come from? Canada has had cultural protections in the bilateral and trilateral NAFTA. When I used to work on the U.S. side, we never had a complaint against Canadian culture. It was just one of those, funky things that Canadians do. but yet it arose last week. I think that came from the political side of the ledger, not from any actual business or negotiating interest in there, and I think it will have a political resolution or it will die a death. On procurement, we seem to be looking at a status quo settlement, which is much better than the dollar for dollar proposal that came out at the beginning. I think Canada can live with the status quo. They prefer more, but they can live with it. Also, on labor mobility. I don't think Canada's going to get anything new on labor mobility, but it seems that emanating from the Mexican negotiations, and again, I'm not sure they actually wrote anything down in those Mexican negotiations, but it seems that there'll be a status quo on the TN visa, which is important for, yeah, the NAFTA visa for Canadians, Mexicans, and Americans, important. So, those are things we can live with. On de minimis, these are the sorts of concessions that people make in the 11th hour of a negotiation, and I think we're maybe at hour 10, maybe at hour 9. I think Canada may be prepared to move on de minimis. The big problem, I think, is not will. It is a technical issue, which is can Canada collect value-added tax on cross-border e-commerce purchases? And if we can collect tax between a purchase made, between Texas and Maryland on Amazon, surely we can figure out a way that those taxes can be collected on a cross-border purchase. So I think it's more technical than substantive on de minimis, and I think Canada is looking for a way through because they are interested in boosting their e-commerce business as well. Finally, on the 232s, very interesting. Mexico left the table, apparently leaving the 232s in place, not requiring a quid pro quo in exchange for the deal that they had already made. So the question for Canada is, do they leave the 232s in place and hope that, again, a U.S. business interest will come riding in on a white horse and say, this makes sense for no one, let's get rid of it? Or does Canada carry the flag on getting rid of 232s and insist that the 232s are eliminated as a result of a NAFTA? Don't know where they're going to go with that. Is Canada ragging the puck? Hockey players, you like that expression. For those who aren't hockey players, unnecessary delays. Canada has the least pressing political imperatives in the conclusion of these negotiations. And at a political level, frankly, Justin Trudeau's popularity swells every time that President Trump writes a nasty tweet about him. So at a political level, it's okay to prolong this. But at a certain point, it will turn, and Prime Minister Trudeau and his government will be attacked for prolonging the instability that the renegotiation has provoked in terms of investment, in terms of production, and as well the 232. So it can go from a political gift to an economic poison very, very quickly. And finally, the dirty secret of these NAFTA negotiations for Canada is that the economic cost of losing the NAFTA is much, much, much less than the cost of tax reform, U.S. tax reform, and the tax gap with Canada, which is estimated to be something like 10 times greater in terms of impact than if Canada lost the NAFTA. So, Donald Trump already won.
Thanks, Laura. A couple quick things. When you talked about the 232s, you were talking about the U.S. national security tariffs on steel and aluminum under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. Also, when you made reference to Class 7, was that ultra-filtered milk?
Yep.
That was the ultra-filtered. We'll talk about ultra-filtered milk a little bit later. Please. And also, I hope I didn't misspeak. I definitely did not suggest that I thought there'd be a trade-off between the TRQs and Chapter 19. I think that so long as there's no softwood lumber agreement, we're not going to see an end to Chapter 19. And as a completely separate matter, I think that there's no possibility we have the leverage to eliminate the TRQs or to get any movement beyond what we got in the TPP, maybe, and maybe not. Our next speaker, Celeste Drake, went from Capitol Hill to the AFL-CIO, where she does trade and globalization policy. And we're very much looking forward to hearing what she has to say about this.
Okay. It's always fun to be the skunk at the picnic, right? So my first comment is, these chairs were not made for the vertically challenged. They're for very tall people. So I'm gonna just give the alternate view of a lot of this. I'm gonna have to say I disagree with most of Matt's introduction and a little bit less of my co-panelists. But I'll start with the fact that from a labor perspective, we think that renegotiating NAFTA was a good thing. We don't think that NAFTA was working. We think that it was working certainly for these companies and the companies that are members of these organizations, but at the same time that you saw some of these companies posting record profits and bragging all around Wall Street about you've got to buy our stock because we're so great, at the same time they're going back to their very workers in the United States and saying, you've got to take a pay cut, you have to take a pension cut. Sorry, we're doing so well, we can't afford to pay you anymore. Or these very same companies posting record profits and saying, please donate to our employees so they can have a nice Thanksgiving. So that's because it's not working. And that's largely because when workers for these companies try to organize and try to say we want a union so that we have some leverage so we can get some higher pay, what they say is, don't do that. If you guys vote for a union, we're going to go over to Mexico, right? And that's documented, and that's what companies do. And that means it's not working for average people. If you're folks who make your money off of wages rather than off of capital, NAFTA has not really been working for you. So that's where we come from. So we say, yeah, renegotiate it, great. When President Trump pulled out of TPP, which we fought vigorously on a number of issues, we said, great. So when we see that some of the things in the new NAFTA are exactly what was in the TPP, we say, not great. It's actually not good for working people to extend periods of exclusivity on prescription medicines because that delays entry into the market of generic drugs, which lowers our medicines prices. So that's not something that we were looking for out of this negotiation, right? When we hear, okay, there's all kinds of new rights for the tech companies to move your personal private data across borders and you don't have any control over what happens to it when it gets across those borders, we say, that's not great. It's already hard enough to hold those companies accountable for what they do with our data when it's here. So these are things that are going in the wrong direction. When you look at what's potentially going in the right direction, some of which is really shocking for a Republican administration, that's what's happening in the labor chapter. And why is it that this particular administration was taking the interests of working people, apparently, to heart, at least in terms of having conversations and trying to figure out what we wanted in the labor chapter when the last administration wasn't? That's hard to know. But those conversations have been happening. When you look at strictly the obligations that were made in the labor chapter, they are bumped up from anything that we've ever seen, whether that was in the original NAFTA or in the May 10th agreements, or even in the TPP, which had a slight plus up from the May 10th in there. If you've been watching the announcements from the labor unions about what they think about the ongoing NAFTA negotiations, you've also seen that the presidents have said, we continue to have concerns about how these obligations will be enforced. So it's one thing to say we're trying to get at this issue, particularly in Mexico, where the critical issue is not just the generic labor chapter, but it's the protection unions that exist solely to keep wages down and to keep workers from actually bargaining and trying to use any leverage. That's the issue. And it seems like that could be addressed if it's going to be enforced. And so the read of the president so far is that there's not anything that gives them confidence that you're going to have that sort of swift and certain enforcement that you need. And it's been our experience that you can continue to sort of plus up what the labor obligations are, but if you don't say, and this is exactly how they're going to be monitored, and this is exactly how we're going to deal with it when we find that parties are not complying, then what you've got is another set of lovely promises that are probably going to be really effective at getting the votes that you need on the Hill from the Democratic Party, but are not really going to be particularly effective at how are you changing the game for working people. And for Mexico, it's a big deal. For, again, as much wealth that you've seen created in Mexico as a result of NAFTA, and as much foreign investment as you've seen as a result of NAFTA, you haven't seen that being shared by Mexico's workers. You essentially have the same poverty rate in Mexico as you had when NAFTA was signed, and that actually means, in practice, millions more people living in poverty because the population is larger. You actually have the few independent unions that exist in Mexico reporting that repression of unions and anti-union behavior by both the federal government and by employers increased as a result of NAFTA, probably because the foreign companies that are coming in, that are being, persuaded to come in by the state governments, the federal governments, they're saying, and we promise you can keep these sort of, labor relations that keep the wages down. So there is an even greater interest in keeping the independent unions down. So we're still looking for that, and we're treating this fact that Canada isn't in yet, and these talks are still going on, as opportunities to continue to plus up those things that we need to be plussed up, and to try and, see if we can mitigate some of the things that we don't like. When you talk about the sunset, we gotta say we're disappointed in the 16-year sunset. We take a different view that trade agreements shouldn't have special status that other laws don't have. The R&D tax credit has to get renewed every single year, which I personally think is really stupid, but it doesn't keep companies from doing R&D. They continue to do R&D, right? Unemployment has to be renewed periodically. Trade adjustment assistance expires. The Higher Education Act expires. The Defense Authorization Act expires. All of these things expire and get renewed, and many of them are actually things that working families want, whether it's the Pell Grants in the Higher Ed Act, or the unemployment assistance, or the worker training in the WIA bill, and yet trade agreements somehow have a special status where they can't be looked at and reauthorized and rejiggered so that they're made better. So we thought that idea was not our idea. We thought it was pretty interesting. And we don't think that it would keep companies from investing, because they invest when it's a good reason to invest. We look at the auto rules of origin. It's not completely clear what that's going to do. I think there's a lot of misconception that somehow it's going to force Mexico to pay a $16 wage in the auto sector, and that's not, I don't believe, what it's about. I think it's about reserving a portion of the auto supply chain for the US and Canada to make sure that all three countries get to play a part. But when you don't hear a lot of kicking and screaming from the auto companies themselves, it's not completely clear what it would do to change the status quo. So we're continuing to look at that and to study that and to see where that would be. In terms of the text that's out there, Congress has it now. If they go to the reading room, they can look at it. They can't share it. The cleared advisors have it. They can, look on the cleared advisor website and review it. A lot of it seems to be not completely in final form. There are brackets, there are comments about this text is yet to be finished. So I think that's sort of what's interesting about what's happening here, is that this administration is treating the fast track requirements a little bit differently than the last administration. So when we went through this with the TPP, when you got to this period, the text was done, right? You have this notice at the top, like subject to final legal review, but the text was done. And so you had the 30 days where cleared advisors and Congress could look at it, but it wasn't changing, new parties weren't coming in, there weren't sort of brackets that said TBD, and then you knew once it went public, at the end of that first 30 days, everyone was going to see the same thing that everybody else had been saying. Now we're not quite so sure, because it seems that we're seeing a text that's not completely complete. So, and the fact that Canada might come in, but it's not really in, and Congress saying, well, that's not consistent with fast track, what does that mean? So now we're hearing from the Hill lots of interesting theories spinning out about, well, if it changes enough, or if Canada comes in, or Canada doesn't come in, maybe the 90-day notice has to be given again, because there's enough that's different, or Congress says, no, we are not going to deal with this unless you give a 90-day notice, because we are going to stick to fast track. Well, if that happens, what happens to this November 30th date? And so there's been a lot of speculation, well, maybe President Peña Nieto signs on that date, and President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau sign on a different date. There's nothing in fast track that says they all have to sign at the same time, right? That's standard, that's tradition, but that's an interesting difference. So, and then there's a lot of questions about if they finish up and they're ready to go, assuming everybody signs on November 30th, then when does Congress vote, right? So traditionally you would think that's gonna happen sometime in early 2019. They're gonna have to wait for the ITC report. They're gonna have to wait for all these other reports. You have to have your mock markup. You have to do all these things. Well, fast track is really an agreement where Congress says, we're gonna tie our hands. And what does this Congress do when you're not sure what's coming in as the next Congress? You're not really sure what's going on with this president. I think there's a lot of interesting questions. And so that's kind of where things are right now, because everything really is up in the air. From our perspective, it's a little bit of a game of chicken right now. Canada's playing chicken, saying it's not going to move on dairy and Chapter 19, and we think they actually do have interests in perhaps getting those medicines provisions, say, back to where they were in TPP. I think they have a few other interests that aren't really being raised to the level right now. The US is playing their own game of chicken, saying these are our dates, has to be signed on the 30th no matter what. Congress is playing chicken, saying you're not complying with, what TPP says, and it's sort of, yes, TPA, thank you. So it's sort of this question of who's going to blink, and are they actually going to sit down? You're talking about adults in the room. Are they going to sit down? Because there are reasonable solutions to all of these things. Are they going to sit down and take them? Or are they going to be guided by, this is what the calendar says, and we can't go off that? So we'll see.
Thanks. If we have time, Ken, I want to throw a couple of questions to the panel before we open it up to the audience. But before I even do that, just with this whole debacle of the time periods and Trade Promotion Authority and meeting the deadlines, everyone should keep in mind something that absolutely nobody is tracking and thinking about, which is that it's not, first of all, none of this complies with TPA in the notice periods. It's not even close. And second of all, it's not simply a matter of will a Congress that supports the president just ignore the fact that TPA notice periods are not being complied with. It's also that if the whole process goes through and ultimately a revised NAFTA is approved by Congress and an implementation act for that is enacted by Congress through the fast track procedure, when it's all done, there is no question that the implementation act portion of it will be subject to being overturned by the U.S. federal courts, because the implementation act at that point will not have been enacted pursuant to the TPA rules properly. And so it's not just a matter of will a Republican Congress ignore the TPA rules. If they do, not the agreement itself, but the agreement's implementation act will be subject to being overturned by the federal courts later on. So keep that in mind. It's not as simple as just political compliance. But I have two questions. One is going to be about labor and organization for Arturo and Celeste. But before that, I want to ask a question of Laura about ultra-filtered milk. And here's my question. I remember 2 years ago in the summer of 2016, when it became clear that this candidate Trump was getting the Republican nomination, this guy who had been railing about NAFTA and railing about many aspects of NAFTA, including the Canadian tariff rate quotas on American dairy. And at that moment, in the summer of 2016, all of a sudden, we had dealt with the tariff rate quota issue for literally since before NAFTA, since 30, 40 years. But all of a sudden came this new dairy issue. The Canadians have the right to put tariff rate quotas on American traditional dairy products. That is to say, dairy products that existed at the time we entered into NAFTA. But modern dairy products like ultra-filtered milk, which did not exist then, we're not given the special exception that allows Canada to put tariff rate quotas on it. And of course, the way it works with dairy, I'm not a dairy expert, but the way it works with dairy is you can kind of turn your dairy into milk or yogurt or into cheese or into what you want to turn it into. So if you just decide to turn all your dairy into ultra-filtered milk, which is not covered by the TRQs, you can still export lots of milk from the United States to Canada, which is why the United States actually has a trade surplus in dairy with Canada because of ultra-filtered milk. Now the Canadians looked at this as the U.S. circumventing their protections, but the U.S. looked at this as saying, and said, look, Canada should not even have those protections in the first place under a free trade agreement. They only have it because they got a grandfather, and it's a technical thing, and so they exist for technical reasons, and we can circumvent them for technical reasons, and the Americans were happy. Then comes the summer of 2016 with Trump really hitting Canada about wanting to get rid of the tariff rate quotas. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, Canada imposes implements a new pricing system for ultra-filtered milk in Canada, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, which lowers the prices of ultra-filtered milk in Canada so much that American dairies can't export the ultra-filtered milk there anymore. So Canada literally created a new dairy issue just when Trump was nominated. And I looked at that as the former lead for USTR on negotiating with Canada and Mexico on trade, and I said, yeah, Canada is creating a dairy issue so that 2 years from now, when they still haven't given in on the TRQs, they have something to give in on. They're literally creating a problem. Trump and his obnoxiousness has created a new problem, which then Trump with his obnoxiousness is going to solve 2 years from now, and then Trump's going to declare victory. And there's going to be no movement on TRQs. It's exactly what I thought, and I actually said it publicly many times. Is that happening, or am I totally wrong?
So